Let me say something about Ben because he's one of the most impressive young Australian politicians. He's in the West Australian Legislative Assembly representing the seat of Victoria Park, which he won at a by-election after the retirement of Jeff Gallop, who had been the former Premier. Of course, Jeff now lives in Sydney, and he's been in this very room in a session we had a couple of years ago on federalism. Ben's attended the Royal Military College at Duntroon, graduating as an officer in 1996, and later received the Australian Defence Medal. After working for a law firm in Perth and Sydney, he received an ambassadorial scholarship in 2001 from the Rotary Foundation, allowing him to study comparative politics at the London School of Economics. He returned to Australia in 2002 and won that seat in 2006. He's the second youngest sitting parliamentarian. He serves now as Shadow Treasurer and the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, amongst other portfolios. Ben will talk. He's got a slide presentation. He will talk for about 20 minutes, I think, or so, and then there's plenty of time for questions. So we'll keep it quite relaxed and quite open. And the discussion, he'll be ranging across West Australian economic development issues and some Indigenous issues as well. So again, welcome and thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you, Greg. Can I acknowledge Michael Darling, the Chair of the Board? Very good to see you. And I also will acknowledge, without meaning to embarrass him, the former National President of my party, Warren Mundine. Good to see you, Warren, although you are shrinking, the amazing shrinking Warren Mundine. Good to see you, my old friend Warren. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. I don't often get to Sydney anymore. My travels tend to take me to places like Karratha and Port Hedland and Kununurra and Esperance and all the places in between in Western Australia. My slide presentation is has a lot to do about the finances of Western Australia, and looking around the room, looking who's here. Many of you will know, so I do apologise. I'll try and get through them relatively quickly so we can perhaps get some questions that you may have of me. And I note that CIS has been very active in the area of Indigenous affairs, and I know there are a lot of publications, many of which I have in my office, so no doubt there'll be some questions in that area as well. Western Australia, as you know, is going through quite a change. The last 10 years we've seen the structure of the WA economy change quite considerably. 10 years ago, royalties at about $650 million made up about 6% of the revenue base. Now, 10 years later, at $5 billion a year, makes up 20% of the revenue base of the state, and that's continuing to climb across the Treasury forward estimates to about 22% of the revenue base of Western Australia. So quite a significant structural change within the WA economy, which has its strengths and its weaknesses that I'll deal with today. There have been basically 4 periods of sort of economic development in Western Australia, preceding the one that started really about in the mid-2000s. From federation to about 1850, you had a period of, from settlement in 1829 to about 1850, very small growth, small population growth. WA started not as a penal colony, like here in New South Wales or in Tasmania, started literally as a result of some creative marketing out of the United Kingdom. Private investment in land, and that led to Western Australia being settled in 1829. So I guess that's perhaps underwritten the entrepreneurial spirit of some of our Western Australians over the last couple of hundred years. So the first period was very stagnant. Population did not really move and was rapidly overtaken by South Australia that was settled after Western Australia. Then, of course, we finally got some convicts. The pastoralists at the time approached the Parliament, demanded that we get some convicts, and the impact of 2 things, obviously very cheap labour, but also the military that came with it, meant that for the first time in Western Australia there was some private accumulation of capital. Up until then, WA had really been a barter system, and there wasn't a capacity to have any accumulation of capital, and that's really been the story of Western Australia. So you saw Western Australia then go through significant growth in that second period from 1850 through to about 1900, because of course we found gold first in Halls Creek in the Kimberley, then in the goldfields in Kalgoorlie, and the mining laws at the time encouraged deep mining, so you had to have a substantial capital base as a company to get access to the gold, which saw then a significant accumulation of capital in Western Australia. The appointment of people like C.Y. O'Connor to the role of chief engineer saw the pipeline built through to Kalgoorlie, Fremantle Port built, and so some dramatic changes happened on the back of what was some significant government spending in infrastructure. And then through to the First World War, the gold boom, if you like, came off, and then we really stagnated through to after the Second World War, and then the 1960 decision of the Commonwealth Government to lift the ban on spending on this export of iron ore changed things fundamentally, and that decision is still being felt in Western Australia. And so we entered into the agreements with the Japanese in the 1960s on the back of the discovery of significant quantities of iron ore deposits in Western Australia that are still being mined today, so that saw us go through really to the current mining boom. I say boom. I just did an interview downstairs. Former Premier Alan Carpenter and current Premier Colin Barnett are very reluctant to use the word boom, and all that brings with it. But whether it is a boom and followed by the consequential bust will still wait to be seen at this point. But we still have a very strong pipeline of work. There's no question that we are feeling and seeing in Western Australia a change. There's more nervousness. It's a bit harder to raise money, but there still is quite a strong amount of work coming through. This is from the Chamber of Minerals and Energy of Western Australia, who just put out their state growth outlook, and you can see the value of work that they estimate is now, in a very short period of time, you look at the growth between 2004 and through to 2011, it's been extraordinary, and about 60%, 65% of the works coming through, the value of those works is the oil and gas and condensate industry. Things like names like Gorgon and Wheatstone and Browse you'd be familiar with, and about 30% is coming through iron ore and related infrastructure. So you have seen, of course, BHP make some decisions around the Port Hedland Outer Harbour, but they're still investing heavily, keen to get to 240 million tonnes per annum export, and Rio Tinto is still investing quite strongly. This is a similar, tells a similar tale. This is the Chamber of Commerce and Industries underway and in the pipeline, and you see there is still a considerable amount of work in Western Australia. This chart here, I was keen to show you. This is where the Chamber of Minerals is seeing over $192 billion in capital expenditure to come, where it's all happening. Now, obviously, the Pilbara is where most of the action is, but you'll see the 31 billion in the Kimberley. The Kimberley will actually undergo the greatest growth in workforce demands. They project, the CME project, that'll double over the next 2 years, the demands for workforce in the Kimberley, and there will be future challenges ahead for governments in terms of how they handle a lot of the exploration and the discovery of deposits from coal in the Fitzroy Valley through to obviously still at James Price Point, and whether the hub eventually goes through. Iron ore royalties, this is what it's done, and this is why you've had such a dramatic shift in the Western Australian government revenue. The black bits at the top, if you like, are the policy impact. The government made the decision, Colin Barnett made the decision to, it was actually sort of initiated by Alan Carpenter and Alan, and then Colin delivered on it, removing the decades-old concession that BHP and Rio had around fines, iron ore. Back in the 60s, there was literally no market for fines, and so a concession was given to the two companies on the royalty rate, which of course subsequently became the most in-demand commodity, fines iron ore. So that was removed, and that's had quite a dramatic impact on the return to the government, which is why you've seen in the space of 10 years royalties move from 600 million to nearly 5 billion, and on its way in the next 3 years to just over $6 billion in terms of revenue to Western Australia. And that has, of course, had an impact on our GST return that I'll also talk about in just a tick. Iron ore prices, I don't need to take you through that, but that is, in terms of the vulnerability of Western Australia, you would have seen We have an estimation in our budget of iron ore at around about $120 a tonne, and with the Aussie dollar at about 90, no, actually just over $1. So when iron ore earlier this year came off and the Aussie and the Australian dollar remained high, it was quite a dramatic impact on the finances of the state. And so we had the government literally forced into finding about $300 million in savings overnight to preserve the budget surplus for this year. And I'll come back to that, some more comments in just a tick. And that's been the increase in the percentage of royalties that make up Western Australia's revenue base. So now over 20%. And of the $5 billion in royalties, about 90% is iron ore. So it's all about iron ore in Western Australia. This has been the reason I mentioned earlier before between 1829 and that 1850, the boom was, all our booms have been accompanied by huge population growth, and then in the bust, everyone tends to head back east. And in fact, the very first anti-Eastern States movement in Western Australia, if you like, came about in the late 1800s when there was a general view that a lot of the profits out of the gold being dug up in Kalgoorlie were heading either to London or to Melbourne. And so that has been one of the challenges of governments over the last 10 years in WA, handling that population growth. About 1,000 people a week currently moving to Perth. Effectively, we have no rentals. The rentals is at capacity, and so it's getting to a point now where it's almost cheaper to have a mortgage than to rent in Western Australia. We can't keep up. The stocks have not kept up, and so when you've had state final demand, which has been extraordinary, and I think the ABS just came out this week and put it at 13.5% in Western Australia. You see where that's been made. Housing is completely the housing bust in WA. Dwelling investment is almost stopped for some time there, but the investment boom mainly at the moment, oil and gas related, is what's driving state final demand. And so that is having some huge impacts. If you're directly employed in the mining sector, Western Australia, Perth's not a bad place to be, but it's a very expensive city now, as anybody who travels to Perth would know. And so there's a lot of people who aren't directly related to the mining sector who are quite resentful, and that's a political issue that we're having to handle, both government and opposition. This is our expected growth is still expected to be strong in WA. Again, as you saw from the state final demand, it's all mining related. It really is and as a result, you get big impacts in the hospitality and tourism sector, and which drives local inflation quite dramatically. The only reason I've put that in there is to show the impact that that has had on Western Australia. For every the impact on the budget is for every drop in the exchange rate between the US Australian dollar, it impacts the WA general government finances by $33 million a cent, and in respect of $60 million a cent, and in respect of every drop in dollar per tonne in iron ore, $33 million. So earlier this year, when we had the Aussie dollar staying very strong and iron ore dropping dramatically, it was having an impact in hundreds of millions of dollars in a very short period of time on the finances of the state. So the strength of having a strong royalty flow is the fact that it's based around a volatile product, and that we all know that ultimately commodities are a volatile product. And so that is really the weakness in the state finances, because ultimately, whilst the GST and the fiscal equalisation is through the GST, there is a delay of about 3 to 5 years before the revenue is replaced. It won't be entirely replaced anymore. The pool is not growing. So WA does have that exposure of volatile commodity prices. GST, I do want to conclude with some comments on the finances around about GST. This is from the CCI, which is sourced from the Department of Treasury. The bottom, there are two. The relativity is, as the Commonwealth Grants Commission decides, is the bottom decreasing curve, and there has been a demand made by Colin Barnett, supported by the opposition, to try and get a per capita base, or at least 75% of the per capita base, and the difference is quite considerable, and that is a result of the equalisation of the royalty flow, the way that the Commonwealth Grants Commission equalises about 70% of the royalty flow. For every $1 billion, about 700 million is equalised across other states in Australia. And so there have been, this is what's driving the complaints. You're hearing them no doubt loud and clear from Western Australia about the GST return, because it has had quite a dramatic impact. The analysis on Gorgon, for example, by Treasury estimates, this was back in 2004, WA Treasury did an estimation of the benefits of Gorgon and where those benefits would flow. About $300 million. What it would boost about $11 to $12 billion. This has probably actually increased since then, to the federal government, $3 billion to other states, and $300 million to Western Australia. So it's a project that, of course, benefits the entire federation. But the complaint of consecutive premiers now, the three premiers have been complaining about it now since the GST was introduced, is that it doesn't recognise the cost that goes into producing those royalties, which of course is significant. When you have that sort of impact of GST, it's not actually being offset by the increase in royalties. But having said that, the state revenue base has continued to grow in the last 4 years, increased by about nearly 30% in the last 4 years. Sorry. So that is something you'll continue to hear from Colin Barnett. You'll continue to hear from Colin if he's re-elected next year, and certainly from Mark McGowan if he becomes Premier next year. It's a common theme. And the demand is really now from Western Australia to say, look, no one expected the return on GST to drop to about 30%, which is what it's projected to do in Western Australia. Colin's asked for a cap of about 75 cents in the dollar. Now we're all waiting on Mr. Greiner, of course, and Mr. Brumby's report to see what they can deliver. I don't know what they can deliver. To change the GST requires unanimous support from all the states, which is going to be very difficult to achieve. But at the moment we have a perverse outcome where Western Australia would benefit from reducing royalty rates financially, but which would, of course, the entire federation would be penalised because the revenue pool would decrease. So that is the reality of the GST. And I want to conclude with this chart here. We talk about the Australian government stimulus. There is still strong demand driven for demand of our iron ore, Australia's iron ore, from Japan and from, in particular, China. This is another slide from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry that the urbanisation of China will continue to drive strong demand, and you're seeing that in the way the investment in the iron ore sector continues to grow. There is now strong Chinese investment coming into the Midwest of Western Australia, into the magnetite industry. You would have seen Oakajee has fallen over again in Western Australia, but over time Oakajee will have to happen. It's the only way that the magnetite iron ore in the Midwest can actually get to market. So that is what is really driving Western Australia. But it is a typical mining boom economy at the moment that has those vulnerabilities that I referred to. One of my other roles, of course, is Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs and Native Title. Which is a role that I know the CIS, Sarah, I know you're sitting here, has been heavily involved in. The mining sector and Aboriginal affairs have been closely linked for a long time, as Warren would know. The mining sector has been excellent actually in getting Aboriginal people into jobs. Where the weaknesses lie are still in those remote communities where people have no literacy skills and have never experienced work, and so getting people into the discipline of work is very, very difficult. So some of the programs that some of the miners are running around getting people with no work skills into work, of those getting a lot more interest from the government, simply because we don't, as opposed to a qualified Aboriginal person now working on a mine, literally being fought over by mining companies, and so rather than having them sort of moving around the different companies, we're trying to get a larger proportion of people, particularly out of those remote communities, that haven't seen the sort of results in education that we've wanted to see. But in Western Australia, we've been good at, and I lugged this across the Nullarbor, the Ord Final Agreement. This is what you would have seen, again, the Chinese investment in Ord 50-year lease, peppercorn lease to get this Ord Stage 2 developed. We've been very good in using native title in Western Australia to settle a lot of native title claims. Eric Ripper, as the Deputy Premier and Treasurer, and is also Minister for Native Title for nearly 8 years, settled a native title over about 1 million hectares in Western Australia, and a lot of that now is seeing strong economic development. The Ord final agreement's perhaps one of the landmark native title settlement within Western Australia, and Colin is now working with the Southwest Aboriginal Land and Sea Council to try and settle native title over Perth and the southwest of Western Australia, which is perhaps the most contentious native title in the state, and that will be a in excess $1 billion settlement if agreed, which will do two things: one, provide all sorts of economic opportunities to the Noongar people, but also hopefully resolve one of the more controversial native title claims, because of course it was the Noongar people that really felt the brunt of colonisation around the Swan River. Education is still not where it should be, and I don't. My dad, who is currently the CEO at Jigalong, and he has been now for a lot of the last 10 years, he retires at the end of this year. The school at Jigalong just has not produced the students it should have, has not produced the standards it should have. My dad makes this point publicly time and again, which is replicated in remote communities across Western Australia. There has been a huge increase in the last 5 years in Perth private schools, very much the best schools in Western Australia, offering a lot more scholarships for high school students, Aboriginal high school students, to come from out of the Kimberley and out of the Pilbara, and they find that the big part of the first 12 months that they are in those schools is literally basic literacy skills, which are just not being developed in those early years, and which is also a conversation that we have to have with Aboriginal communities to prioritise education. One of the more devastating impacts on the attendance of Aboriginal kids at schools has been funerals. Funerals take kids out of schools for periods of months, and there has to be some compromise there. This is something I have raised publicly in Western Australia. There has to be a compromise to ensure that kids' education is not fatally compromised, where they're spending up to 6 months out of school in year 2 and 3. Because if you can have the best schools in Australia, but if the kids aren't turning up, and if the parents or the families aren't prioritising the schools, then we're not going to see those sort of changes in those communities that we need. But you're certainly seeing now, instead of kids leaving those primary schools and going into a high school, a district high school, a lot more coming to Perth with a lot more support around bringing family with them, so that they stay at the Aquinas or Wesley or Santa Maria or St Bridget's and all the very good schools in Perth. And so you're seeing a lot more kids graduating from year 12 with from excellent schools with excellent results. So Western Australia is an extraordinary state at the moment. I cannot get over the changes that we've seen in the last 10 years. Those figures that I outlined explain why we've seen those changes. There are oil and gas, onshore gas has the capacity to be a game changer in Western Australia. There's a lot of gas being found onshore up in the Kimberley and in the Midwest that would obviously see a direct financial benefit to Western Australia, as opposed to the offshore gas that, of course, is the financial benefit goes to the federal government. There are controversies, and we were discussing a minute ago over lunch James Price Point and the relationship with the Kimberley Land Council and other Aboriginal groups and Woodside. That will ultimately, the state processes have nearly finished. The federal environmental approval at some point, I dare say, will happen, and then a final investment decision that's been delayed to, I think, mid-next year will ultimately decide the outcome of that. But there won't be, if that group doesn't proceed with James Price Point, there still will be pressure for some form of onshore location in the Kimberley. And Santos, I think, this week announced another large find of gas in the Browse Basin.